And so, we're continuing to face disruption in parts of Scotland because of the weather. Altnahara in Sutherland saw temperatures fall to minus 17.1 Celsius. Braemar went down to minus 22.9. That's the lowest since 1995. Pensioners in Fife are left out in the cold over COVID vaccine blunder. Lib Dem leader says families are crying out to visit relatives in care homes. And Nicola Sturgeon will relish speaking out on the Alex Salmond story. From Caledonia Media, I'm Charles Fletcher with Scotland's favourite political show, The Week in Holyrood.
All along, I was determined that I would do nothing to intervene in or compromise the confidentiality and the independence and the integrity of a process that was kicked off because women, whose voice, frankly, has been too often lost in this whole process, because women came forward with complaints. And I thought it was important that they got properly investigated and not swept under the carpet just because of the seniority and the party affiliation of who those complaints were about. So I'll set out my account openly and fully, and I relish at long last to have the opportunity to do it.
Matanva, Fiskama. The First Minister and the Health Secretary have apologised to pensioners left to queue in freezing weather for their vaccination, only to have their appointments postponed. The double booking shambles came about as NHS Fife transferred work to a new national booking system. One elderly woman collapsed in the queue in Lochgelly in Fife. Nicola Sturgeon says it's down to a glitch in the new system, and she's sorry.
You know, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that everything is going to be perfect all the time. But yesterday there was a particular problem in Fife because Fife was migrating onto the Service Now platform that I've been speaking about, that all mainland boards are going to be on by the end of this week. And that led to a bit of a rebooking issue that meant that some of their clinics were effectively double booked, which meant appointment slots were too short and people were queuing when they shouldn't have been, and obviously given the weather conditions yesterday, that was particularly regrettable. NHS Fife have apologised for that. I know they're working hard to ensure that doesn't recur, and all health boards will be working really hard to make sure these problems don't arise. I don't expect people not to feel annoyed when these things happen, because ideally they shouldn't happen, and that's why an apology is right. But I would ask everybody to just bear in mind how hard health boards are working right now to get this programme delivered as quickly as possible. And, you know, I talk about people emailing me if you haven't got an appointment or if you have got questions that you can't get answers to. You know, I'm inundated with emails right now from people saying, got my vaccine today or yesterday, so impressed with how efficient it was, everything went well. These teams out there are performing a monumental task right now, and they're doing it really well. So if things go wrong in any given day, as I'm afraid from time to time they might, we are sorry about that, but we are trying to do this as quickly, as fast and as efficiently as we possibly can. The high uptake in care homes, older people's care homes, is really good. I know the Health Secretary is on an ongoing basis looking at how we can get greater normality back to visiting in care homes as quickly as possible. It's important that we don't do that in a way that risks older people in care homes any more than obviously we want to do. We know the vaccine takes 2 or 3 weeks to give any protection. We also still have questions. The scientific community have unanswered questions about the impact it has on transmission of the virus. So there is no doubt the vaccine will help pave the way to greater normality in visiting arrangements, but we've got to make sure we do that carefully and safely, and the Health Secretary is considering these issues right now. But Jason may want to say some more about that.
Only to say that new guidance is imminent. So that will be published shortly once the Cabinet Secretary has some final meetings with officials. She's met with the Care Home Relatives Group a number of times, as have I. It's not just vaccine, it's also protection from outbreaks, it's test and protect, it's staff, it's PPE, and then it's about what should and could be permitted for families to reconnect after such a long time. It really is. I think after schools, it's the next big priority for us. I don't mean it has to follow the schools opening. I just mean it's right up there with getting kids back to some form of normality. So the Cabinet Secretary has said publicly that will be published just as soon as we can, and shortly is the best I can do for you.
In the Chamber, Health Secretary Jean Freeman came under pressure from Lib Dem leader Willie Rennie.
Let me start, Presiding Officer, by apologising to all those who were affected by the problems in the NHS Fife vaccine clinics yesterday. The issue specifically in Fife is restricted to Fife, as I understand it, was the result of an IT issue with the Service Now national scheduling system, and that resulted in overbooking of appointments. I have today, this morning, written to Fife MSPs and MPs, apologising, explaining in detail and setting out the action underway for those affected. Urgent work is underway by NHS National Services Scotland to resolve the issue. A permanent fix to the system will be in place by the end of the week, but in advance of that, standard operating procedures have been revised to ensure that the issue is not repeated. In NHS Fife, they are making alternative arrangements to ensure that appointments booked for today and tomorrow can still go ahead. For today and tomorrow, all those with an appointment will be vaccinated, with NHS Fife increasing capacity at 5 of their clinics. The Scottish Ambulance Service are also providing additional vaccinators and, where that is required, mobile units. For later affected appointments,
I want to thank the Health Secretary for that genuine apology, but I was disappointed earlier on that the First Minister said that nothing was wrong with the vaccination programme. I happen to think that it is wholly unacceptable for people over the age of 70, many who have not been out of their house for months, to be left waiting in sub-zero conditions for hours on end. Some waited for 4 hours for an injection. A lady collapsed in Lochillie. Another, who was just out of hospital with breast cancer, was told to wait for 2.5 hours. So why was the problem only discovered when people turned up for their appointment? Why were these 7,000 double bookings not spotted manually in advance?
So first of all, there were not 7,000 double bookings, and I'm very happy to ensure that Mr Rennie and any other interested colleagues have exactly the right number. As I said, it wasn't acceptable, and I'm not sure what more Mr Rennie wants me to say about that. It wasn't acceptable. NHS Fife have acted to resolve the problem for those who did not get vaccinated, who turned up, and for those who would have been affected today and tomorrow and later on into the week, had the problem not been identified and steps been taken to resolve it. Essentially what happened was that as NHS, as I understand it, and I'm not an IT guru by any stretch of MD's imagination, as I understand it, as NHS Fife transferred from local booking arrangements to the national booking portal, there was an issue with the data transfer that was not spotted until the clinics happened. Now, part of what NSS, our national system, Service Now and NHS Fife and Government are all looking at right now is exactly why. They're looking at two things. First of all, fixing that so that that doesn't happen again. But in order to fix it so it doesn't happen again, they need to understand why did it happen in the first place and why was it not flagged up by the system before we actually got to the clinics. As they resolve those two matters, again, I'm very happy to ensure that Mr Rennie and other interested colleagues have that explanation. But right now, until they resolve the problem by understanding exactly what the problem was, I can't give more detail at this point.
Well, it was the Health Secretary's letter this morning that referred to the 7,000 bookings. So what I need to understand, though, is if we still don't fully understand what the problem was, how can we be sure it's not going to be repeated tomorrow or the day after? And if we move other boards to the centralised system, how do we know it's not going to happen to them as well? What lessons have been learned from the event at the Caird Hall in Dundee? And finally, what advice does the Health Secretary have for the over 70s in Fife who have no letter because the helpline is currently not helping them?
The point I'm trying to make is the way in which we will ensure that the system is fixed is by understanding exactly what the problem was and why it wasn't flagged up at the point when it happened, as opposed to later when people were turning up for appointments. That is the work that is underway in order to not only fix the system, but to ensure where problems arise, there are additional flags in the system. In terms of other boards are already on Service Now, have been for some time. Fife is one of the late transitioners to Service Now, and in fact, by the end of this week, all our mainland health boards will be on Service Now. And the reason for that is because we do need that national booking system in the same way as we need the national vaccine management tool, because that allows us nationally to look ahead at the planned bookings against the known supply, so that we can manage those two much better. So it is the right thing to do to have everyone onto the Service Now platform. The majority of boards are already on it, and this problem has not arisen before. I think I've answered Mr Rennie's question in full, but if I've missed something, please let me know.
Annabel Ewing, SNP, Cowdenbeath, says the issues in the Fife rollout this week are grim.
I do agree that this is a rollout of a programme that the likes of which we probably haven't really seen before in our lifetimes, and I commend all those who are doing their bit, but it remains the case that many of my constituents had a very, very grim day indeed yesterday, queuing outside in the freezing cold at the Lokelly Centre for the COVID vaccine, and then not even in the main to get it. So, you know, there's a lot of people who are really individually not perhaps impressed, albeit perhaps collectively a bit more impressed. But I think the key thing now, Cabinet Secretary, is to focus on absolute clarity about the information that these individuals affected yesterday and ones that may be affected in the course of this week as a result. What is to happen now? I have heard you say in an answer twice what is to happen. What I think NHS Fife should do now is to make that very clear to these people, because I can assure you it is not clear to the people who are affected. And indeed, it may be that a call is the more appropriate action in the circumstances, rather than waiting for a letter that, as we know, given the post and the weather, may be a wee bit delayed. So I would really make a plea, Cabinet Secretary. These people simply, they want clarification as to the position, and I'm sure the NHS Fife could do that and could do it quickly. Thank you.
So I'm grateful to Ms Ewing. That is a very constructive and helpful suggestion, and when we are finished here in the Chamber, I will go away and make sure that that happens.
Shadow Health Secretary Donald Cameron raises a question over the vaccine rollout for the House Band. He suggests it's a significant failing of the vaccination programme, much to the obvious disdain of Jean Freeman.
Many of this group should have received their vaccine but still haven't done so. They are feeling abandoned and forgotten, according to some GPs. Does the government accept this is a significant failing of the vaccine rollout, and what is being done to remedy it?
Oh, I know, Mr Cameron, you keep looking for significant failings. No, this is not one. What is the case is that I have asked all boards to update me on where they are. It is GP practices and primary care that will, quite rightly, be vaccinating those who are housebound. They're working their way around that number of people. They're making considerable progress, and I have no doubt whatsoever that they will complete that as quickly as they possibly can. I think that Fife has, notwithstanding the problem at Service Now, Fife has acted to try and resolve that with our help and with the ambulance services' help. But, you know, I don't want for 1 second to diminish the upset and the difficulty and the concern experienced by those yesterday who turned up to be vaccinated, who were waiting in the cold and who were not in the end vaccinated. That will have been a very distressing experience indeed. But to everyone else, I want to say, in a national programme that is vaccinating 4.5 million people, that is now going at pace faster than elsewhere in the UK, it is bound to be the case that we will, and for which we are creating an infrastructure as we go, there will be glitches and there will be problems. We need to fix those, we need to apologise for them, we need to ensure they don't happen again, but what we must not do is use those glitches and problems to undermine the success of the entire programme, which right now is proving itself.
NHS 5 Chief Executive Carol Potter apologised for the mistakes that left elderly people standing in significant queues. She says it is entirely unacceptable. The Scottish Lib Dem leader Willie Rennie is calling on the government at Holyrood to clearly map out when we can visit elderly relatives in care homes. He says the lack of visiting is causing concern, stress and illness for residents and their families.
Care home residents have been separated from their families for months, just when they needed each other most. I've had detailed and helpful discussions with the Health Secretary and the Chief Nursing Officer on how to allow safe visiting. So now that almost all the care home residents have been vaccinated, will their families be allowed in soon? Will it be possible to allow safe visiting by, say, the middle of February, when immunity takes hold?
First Minister.
I very much hope that we can reach that position soon, but just as I have tried to avoid doing in the past, I've tried to refrain from giving simplistic or easy answers, even if I know they are the answers everybody wants to hear. There is new guidance on care home visiting that is being worked on right now. It will be published imminently. I don't think we've got a precise date for it yet, but it will be published imminently. And it is looking, in light of the current rates and levels of the virus, and also, of course, in light of the extremely high uptake of vaccination in care homes, what is possible in terms of designated visitors that can have much greater normality in their interactions with care home residents. Of all the really, really difficult things that people are having to live with as a result of this pandemic, I know that this is one of the most difficult. People who are separated from older relatives, generally people who are separated from older relatives and can't have normal interaction, but that is particularly difficult and cruel, I think, for people whose older relatives are residents in care homes. We want to get to a much better position as quickly as possible, but we must do that carefully, and we must do that in a way that prioritises the safety of those residents and everybody who works in a care home environment. Remembering, because I will never, for as long as I live, forget the toll of deaths in our care homes last year. There are still people dying in our care homes from COVID, although at lower numbers than last year. I don't want us ever to go back to that position, which is why these decisions have to be taken so carefully.
Willie Rennie.
I'm pleased that the First Minister indicates that it might happen soon, and I'm also pleased that there will be new guidance. But considering many of them don't have much time left, every single day does count. Anne has early onset dementia. Her daughter said, "I find it absolutely awful thinking what is going through her head just now." That those faces she used to know, visiting her all the time, are no longer there. Families are giving evidence to Parliament today. Families are crying out for urgent change. We've heard their voices. They do want that safe access. Clinicians say that separation is worsening dementia, as visits from their family are the only tether to reality that some people have left. Residents in care homes should be living, not just existing. So can I press the First Minister just a little bit more? Can she give families hope? And can she give them some date as to when safe home visiting will begin?
First Minister.
Look, I'm not going to give a date today before we're in a position to do that. I think that would be wrong, because that would be running the risk of giving families false hope, and I don't want to do that. When we get to that position, and I hope that will be sooner rather than later, I want that to be on the basis of well-considered advice and guidance that has been properly informed by clinical evidence and clinical input, and so that when we are giving a date, that is a date that we can have some confidence in. I'd say two things to people. I don't expect either of them to make a single person who's in this scenario feel any better, because I don't underestimate for a second how deeply traumatic this is. But the first thing I would say is I know how deeply traumatic it is, or at least I can imagine. So, you know, I don't need, this is not a criticism of Willie Rennie reading out that kind of testimony. I know this. I feel this. My heart breaks for people in this position. And the second thing is, what possible interest would I have, or the Health Secretary have, for delaying a minute longer than necessary a return to normality. We all want to get back to normality generally as quickly as possible, but particularly back to normality on these things that matter so deeply to all of us. So we will do this as quickly as possible, but it is incumbent on me and the Health Secretary to do it as safely as possible so that we're not standing here later this year having discussions across this chamber about why we've got more people dying in our care homes again from COVID. So these are difficult decisions. The difficulty of the decisions are as nothing compared to the difficulty of the reality relatives are living with. But I would urge people to try to understand the reasons why this has to be done as carefully as we are trying to do it.
From Monday, everyone who flies into Scotland will have to check into quarantine hotels at their own cost for 10 days. Transport Secretary Michael Matheson says the bookings will cost £1,750 and includes isolated accommodation, 3 meals a day in your room and 2 COVID tests. 6 hotels near Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow airports have been identified to host the programme, which will see security staff on site to ensure the passengers don't try to slip out. But there's a loophole. If you land at Heathrow then travel to Scotland, you'll be able to bypass the isolation. And the UK government's quarantine programme is not as thorough. Scotland is imposing the measure on all incoming passengers. Westminster has a list of 33 target countries. Michael Matheson says Westminster needs to toughen up.
So the most effective way for managed isolation to operate is that an individual goes into a quarantine facility at their point of arrival into the country, not at the end of their journey within that country. And the point that we have made to the UK government, given the policy approach that we're taking here in Scotland, we would like all individuals coming into the UK where their final destination is Scotland, that they should go into managed isolation hotels. That would require the UK government to implement our policy at the other airports that will be entry points within England. To date, we don't have agreement on that matter, but I can assure the member we're continuing to pursue that with them, because that would assist us greatly in ensuring that we reduce the risk of the new variant being introduced into Scotland. Notwithstanding that, I strongly believe, based upon all of the clinical advice I've read, the assessment that came from COG, the Joint Biosecurity Assessment Centre's assessment of this matter, the most effective way for the whole of the UK to address the issue of reducing the risk of new variants being introduced into Scotland and the rest of the UK is through a comprehensive managed quarantine system right across the whole of the UK. And I still believe that is the best thing that the UK government could put in place to address some of those wider concerns that we have about individuals arriving at airports in England.
Alexander Stewart, followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scottish airports will need to transport passengers from aircrafts to their quarantine venues. Therefore, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to confirm how these transfers will take place and who will be carrying out these transfers?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, this is part of the contract that's been taken forward and been implemented across the 4 nations. The arrangements will be that from the point of arrival is that those individuals who require to go into self-isolation hotels will be taken and transported to the hotel that they have been allocated. So the whole process will start from the point of arrival right through to the point of being transported to the managed isolation hotel. And that will all be part of a comprehensive package that's been put in place as part of the contract arrangement.
And Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's announcement on supervised quarantine, as we have seen that this is a successful measure to help tackle the spread of COVID-19 in other countries. But can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how will the Scottish Government engage with accommodation providers to ensure that appropriate infection control measures are maintained to the appropriate high standard consistently at all times within the hotels that will be booked?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the specification for the hotels sets out a range of measures that they have to put in place, including specifications that relate to the hygiene standards that need to be maintained and also security that has to be maintained within the facility. The arrangements in the hotel will be as an individual is allocated a room, they will not be able to mix with other guests. in that room. They will obviously be provided with their meals and drinks, etc., as part of a complete package of measures, and also the tests that will be carried out during the course of their period of isolation. And all of the arrangements that the hotels need to have in place are part of that wider contract that they must comply with. I suspect that going forward, that in the introduction of any complex piece of arrangement like this, there will be some challenges at the start. There will be some areas where it will need to improve, or we will have to smooth out some of the initial difficulties. But the contract seeks to address all of the issues in relation to making sure hygiene standards are maintained and that arrangements around security and the isolation of those who are residing in the hotels is maintained appropriately as well.
Now, the story rumbling round the Holyrood bubble has created an extended household with the Westminster bubble. The Nationals and the networks are noticing the chatter. As you know, there's a Holyrood committee investigating the Scottish Government's handling of sexual misconduct complaints against the former First Minister, Alex Salmond. In 2018, Mr Salmond took the government to court, where it was accepted the internal probe had been unlawful. It was the end of the lifelong friendship between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond. He says there's been a conspiracy against him. She says that's nonsense. We'll hear from former Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill shortly, but first, this report from Alec Thompson at Channel 4 News.
So long awaited, now postponed. Alex Salmond will not be appearing before MSPs here at Holyrood tomorrow. Tuesday's toast, as one MSP put it.
Alex Salmond is saying, although he's happy to testify, he'll only do so if the committee publishes all of his submissions. The committee says it's published a great deal of his submissions, but Alex Salmond is holding out. He wants all of them published.
Mr Salmond clearly wants his story out there, unedited, uppercase, red letters. The former First Minister, now widely seen as wanting revenge against his own party, former allies and friends, on two fronts. First, his successful judicial review, which proved the SNP government had mishandled sexual harassment allegations against him. Second, his acquittal on all sexual misconduct charges in the subsequent court case, which could have ruined him.
You refute that.
Next week, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon will answer questions at the Holyrood Committee. She was asked today if she'd ever misled the courts over allegations against Alex Salmond.
I refute that, absolutely. And I look forward to getting the opportunity at long last to appear before the Committee of Inquiry. I very much hope that will be next week, assuming they don't postpone it again. And let me be very clear, I am willing to answer all and any questions put to me by that committee, including on the topic that you have just asked me.
Does it matter? Well, if it was proven that the First Minister had misled the courts, that would be, by custom, a resignation matter in normal times. But it remains hypothetical, and these are not normal times. Enter Peter Murrell this morning, Nicola Sturgeon's husband and SNP Chief Executive.
Can we stop because one voice is interfering with another?
Called for a second time to the committee. Some MSPs feel he's been evasive about what he knew of meetings between his wife and Alex Salmond.
When I asked you, I said to you, you were not in the House at the time, and you said, I was not at home during either meeting. That was a false statement. Yes or no?
I refuse.
Yes or no, Mr Murrell. It's not a difficult question. Well, was that a false statement?
Mr Fraser, please let Mr Murrell answer. Mr Murrell.
I have no idea how long the meeting lasted. I wasn't here.
Peter Murrell repeatedly denied giving the committee false answers under oath.
So just as the SNP is riding high in the polls, just as it looks set for a strong performance in the elections in May, and just as a second independence referendum looks on the cards, the party appears bent on attacking itself. And this is far from the only front.
In recent days, Joanna Cherry, a major SNP force in Westminster, sacked from the frontbench team in a row over transgender issues.
No debate can be a cover for transphobia.
That forced the First Minister into damage limitation, a video message to the party faithful.
Transphobia is wrong and we must treat it with the zero tolerance.
She'll hope that issue, like the committee hearings, can soon be put behind her. Alex Salmond evidently has other ideas. Alex Thompson, Channel 4 News, Holyrood.
And following her departure, Joanna Cherry tweeted that despite hard work, results and a strong reputation, she'd been sacked from the SNP front bench. I'm joined now by SNP MP Kenny McCaskill, who served in Alex Salmond's cabinet as Justice Secretary when he was First Minister. Mr McCaskill, parliamentary officials say that Alex Salmond would have been free tomorrow to give a lengthy opening statement and have 4 hours to answer questions. Why wasn't that enough?
Well, I think the Scottish Parliament is supposed to pride itself on openness, transparency and accountability. I think the situation within the Scottish Parliament is becoming farcical. He was being told that he would have to take the oath to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, and yet it was becoming quite clear that some of the issues that he would wish and indeed would require to comment on, he might very well find himself being prosecuted by the Crown Office. So I think he was put in a position where it's entirely untenable. What the Scottish Parliament inquiry should be doing is making sure that all the information that they want, and indeed a lot of the information that they want, hasn't been provided, but it most certainly should be. And indeed, it's also the case, I think, that the parliamentary inquiry hasn't gone as far as I think the wider public are entitled to expect.
But haven't you just given the game away there, that the only difference with Alex Salmond giving a press conference versus appearing in front of the committee is that if he gives a press conference, he wouldn't be on oath, whereas in the committee he would be?
No, I think fundamentally this is about the publication of documents, because what they're saying is that the documents won't be there to be published. We have the absurd situation that there are documents circulating on social media, published on websites such as The Spectator down south, that the Scottish Parliament is saying they can't publish.
Well, if we just stand back for a minute, isn't this really, Alex Salmond is intent on protecting himself, fair enough, but in doing so, doesn't he risk sabotaging the party?
Well, let's be quite clear, this is entirely unedifying, I think, for the Scottish Parliament and indeed for Scotland as an institution.
Unedifying for the SNP too, though.
Well, yes, I'm minded of an incident in Ireland in the early 1980s when I think the late Conor Cruise O'Brien described it as the acronym GUBU, grotesque, unbelievable, bizarre and unprecedented. That was when a serial killer or double murderer was found in the home of the Attorney General. This is equally bizarre, unprecedented, inexplicable, but we require to address it. What we cannot do is wash it under the carpet. To be able to go forward, to maintain the credibility that we have to have openness and transparency. That's what the Scottish Parliament's about. And if the Scottish Parliament Committee cannot deliver it, then it will have to be a judge-led inquiry.
You're listening to The Week in Holyrood. I'm Charles Fletcher. Coming up in this half hour, questions to the First Minister, and Scotland reaches a vaccine milestone. First then to FMQs, and they're dominated by both Conservative and Labour parties focusing on what Nicola Sturgeon says and what Alex Salmond says. One thing Nicola Sturgeon says she isn't about to do is resign, and what's more, she'll happily answer any questions under oath in the Holyrood Committee next week. Alex Salmond has failed to appear before the committee. Nicola Sturgeon suggests if it really wants to hear from her predecessor, the members could be more ambitious in using parliamentary power. We begin with Conservative Group Leader at Holyrood, Ruth Davidson.
SNP Chief Executive Peter Murrell may have committed perjury by changing his story under oath to a committee inquiry of this Parliament. But he has been very clear about one thing. Nicola Sturgeon didn't discuss the Alex Salmond meetings with him as her party Chief Executive. It's just about the only thing he's given a straight answer on. He was certain that the meetings were government business. Did Peter Murrell tell the truth under oath?
First Minister.
Yes, he did tell the truth. Of course, he's perfectly capable of standing up for himself. He doesn't need me to do it. I'll get my opportunity, of course, to set out my account to the committee, assuming the committee doesn't postpone it again next Tuesday, and I relish that opportunity. It's perhaps clear to everyone why the opposition parties are so keen to drag Peter Murrow into a process that he had no part in and to try to damage him. Perhaps they know how integral he's been over the past 15 years to the electoral success of the SNP and conversely to the electoral defeats of their parties. So perhaps that motive is very, very transparent indeed.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister said yes there, but the SNP Chief Executive evidence conflicts with the First Minister's, and only one can be right. And there is a pattern here of a ruling party of government acting beyond reproach, a Chief Executive changing his story, a suddenly forgetful First Minister, votes of Parliament ignored and promises of cooperation broken. Officials coached at taxpayers' expense, forced to change their evidence, lawyers shutting down key witnesses and statement. This Parliament, this country, shouldn't have to put up with this. So today I'm sharing evidence that the committee won't publish. Evidence that's been shut down, even though it's already in the public domain. The First Minister doesn't need to wait for her committee appearance to answer these questions because the committee won't publish the evidence anyway. Alex Salmond says that the First Minister set up a meeting on the 14th of July in her home and that after that she called him on the 18th of July to discuss the ongoing situation. Did the Permanent Secretary know about those meetings before they happened?
First Minister.
I've set out an account of the dates on which I spoke to Alex Salmond in person and on the telephone already in my written evidence. I told the Permanent Secretary that these meetings had happened. I've told the committee in written evidence when all of that happened. And I will go into all of that in detail on oath before the committee next week. That is the right and proper way to do this. I want to sit in front of the committee. I've had accusations levelled at me now for, 2 years? I've not been able to answer those fully, firstly because of ongoing criminal proceedings and latterly out of respect to the process of this committee. It's not me that's refusing to sit in front of the committee. I'm relishing the prospect of doing that, and then people can hear my account and they can make up their own minds. In the meantime, I'll get on with doing the job the people across this country want me to do, which is to get on with leading this country through a pandemic.
Well, if you pick your way through that answer, it sounds as if she only informed the Permanent Secretary after the meeting and after the phone call. So let's get the story straight. In everyone else's mind, including Peter Murrell's, this was always a government matter. But according to the First Minister's story, it only became a government matter on the 6th of June when she wrote to the Permanent Secretary that she knew about the investigation. So on the 6th of June, this became, to the First Minister's mind, a government matter. And being a government matter, she then, a month later, set up a meeting with Alex Salmond in her house on the 14th of July. And then she called him 4 days later. All of this on a government matter, all without an official present, all without a record taken, and all against the ministerial code. So let me ask the First Minister, if she knew that this was government business on the 6th of June, why did she set up these July meetings and phone calls without an official present and without a record taken?
You see, Ruth Davidson, I think she did a moment ago, say, I'm going to reveal evidence that nobody will otherwise hear. Everything that she's just said, to the, as far as I can recall it, and people can check on my written evidence, is all set out in the written evidence that I've already given to the committee. That's published. That's been published for months. I've been patiently waiting now to give oral evidence to the committee. I think my date to do that, and I understand the reasons why, has been postponed certainly 2, perhaps 3 times, and I certainly hope to be sitting in front of the committee answering all of these questions on oath next Tuesday morning, and people can listen to that and they can make up their own minds, because I believe it is important to subject myself to scrutiny, to make sure the government is subjected to scrutiny, but also to have the opportunity to take head-on some of the ridiculous conspiracy theories that people like Ruth Davidson, in my view, have been all too quick to want to indulge. And I call on anybody who's got anything to help with the process of this committee to sit before that committee and do what I am going to do and put an account on the record on oath, because I'm not the one who is refusing to do that. All of my meetings, as I've said before, were in my capacity as party leader. I will say that again orally. I informed the Permanent Secretary in June when I thought the government was going to be subjected to legal challenge. I've made all of that clear. And all along I was determined that I would do nothing to intervene in or compromise the confidentiality and the independence and the integrity of a process that was kicked off because women, whose voice, frankly, has been too often lost in this whole process, because women came forward with complaints. And I thought it was important that they got properly investigated and not swept under the carpet just because of the seniority and the party affiliation of who those complaints were about. So I'll set out my account openly and fully, and I relish at long last to have the opportunity to do it.
Presiding Officer, these women were failed. They were failed by the system that was set up by her government. And while they were being failed, the First Minister knew exactly what she was meeting Alex Salmond about, and she chose not to tell her officials in advance, and she chose not to keep a record. And she kept speaking to Alex Salmond all throughout this process that failed all of these women. And then she came into this chamber and she told Parliament things that utterly contradicted by her own evidence and testimony. So we have failed women, taxpayers' money and a cover-up at the heart of government. And this whole affair stinks to high heaven. And someone should take responsibility for these failings. Shouldn't it be you, First Minister?
First Minister.
Well, in terms of the government and in terms of my role as First Minister, the scrutiny is right and proper, which is why I am freely subjecting myself to that scrutiny. That is right and proper. I've waited a long time to get the opportunity to do it next Tuesday, and I now relish that opportunity. What I think is very clear, certainly been clear from Ruth Davidson, and may I say it has been clear, I think, from some members of the committee, that actually it doesn't matter to them what I say next Tuesday. It doesn't matter what any of us say before the committee, because they've prejudged the issues. They have decided in advance what the rights and wrongs of this are. The roots of this whole issue are in complaints that came forward not about my behaviour, but about somebody else's behaviour, and it was right that those were properly investigated. We know, because this is why the judicial review action collapsed in the way it did, that the government made a mistake in applying the procedure, and I deeply regret that, because I think that did let down women. But any process now that is indulging conspiracy theories without insisting that people come before the committee to substantiate those theories, in my view, also lets down the women. So the scrutiny of me and my government is right and proper, and I do not shy away from that. On the contrary, I've been waiting a long time to sit before the committee and face up to that. There's also, of course, another process ongoing into whether, or as I would say, not, I breached the ministerial code. And it's important to allow that to take its course as well. But I say again, Presiding Officer, it really does feel to me as if there are certain people in this chamber who have already prejudged all of this and are not interested in what I or anybody else have to say about it.
Labour's interim leader Jackie Baillie repeatedly calls on the First Minister to confirm she'll stand down if found to have broken the ministerial code. Nicola Sturgeon says she doesn't believe she's broken it, so won't bandy about with hypotheticals.
As a member of the Committee on the Scottish Government handling of harassment complaints, I will not prejudge the outcome before the First Minister gives evidence next week, and she knows I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories. But it does appear that the government procedures were deeply flawed and that 2 women were let down by the process, which I think we would all agree we must ensure never happens again. Can I say to her, though, the First Minister knows, and she's just referenced it, that she is subject to a referral for a potential breach of the Ministerial Code being investigated by James Hamilton QC. The Ministerial Code exists to protect the public interest, to ensure that there is trust between politicians and the public, and for the public to hold the government to account. It is therefore critically important. Can I therefore ask her, if she is found to have breached the Ministerial Code, will she resign?
First Minister.
This is the Jackie Baillie that's not prejudging the outcome of these. I tell you what, when we have the outcomes of the committee process, and let me say on the committee process, and there have been women involved in this who have, I know because it's published, written to the committee saying that they think the committee process is now letting them down as well, and I think it's important not to lose sight of that. So when the committee has concluded its work, and I still hope the committee will perhaps use the powers that are available to it to ensure that everybody relevant sits before this committee and gives evidence, but that's a matter for the committee and for Jackie Baillie. But when the committee has reported, and when James Hamilton, again, I'm fully, as I am obliged to do, cooperating with that inquiry, when the outcomes of those are published, then people can ask me then, and I can set out what I intend to do. But I do not believe I breached the ministerial code, and that is my position right now, and I think I'm entitled to due process just like everybody else.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I say to the First Minister, I'm not prejudging the outcome of the ministerial code. I asked her if she had breached it, what action would she take. I'm neither asking her about the committee. So the First Minister cannot simply ignore the ministerial code. That would have deeply damaging consequences to this Parliament, to the government and to our democracy. So let me ask her, on the 29th of March 2018, the First Minister attended a meeting here in Parliament with Jeff Aberdeen, the former Chief of Staff to Alex Salmond. The First Minister claimed to have forgotten about that meeting and told the Parliament that the meeting was fleeting or opportunistic. But it was the case that the meeting was pre-arranged and for the specific purpose of discussing the complaints made against Alex Salmond. Can I remind the First Minister of paragraph 1.2, section C of the Ministerial Code, which says it is of paramount importance that ministers give accurate and truthful information to the Parliament, correcting any inadvertent error at the earliest opportunities. Ministers who knowingly mislead the Parliament will be expected to offer their resignation. So I ask again, if the First Minister is found to have breached the Ministerial Code, will she resign?
First Minister.
I don't believe I did breach the ministerial code, and therefore I'm not going to engage on the hypothetical. When James Hamilton issues his report, we can have an open discussion on the basis of whatever findings he arrives at, just as we will no doubt have an open discussion when the committee arrives at whatever findings it arrives at. I do think Jackie Baillie is really stretching it here to say she's not prejudging things and then ask me a string of questions exactly designed to prejudge the outcome of this. Now, all of these issues that she has raised here, she will get the opportunity in proper full session, not just with selective bits of it, but in the whole course of this, to ask me whatever question she chooses to on Tuesday. I look forward to having that opportunity, and we'll do that properly. I think that is the best way to ensure full scrutiny of me and my government. I think that is the best way to try to respect the rights and the interests of the women whose complaints started this whole process. And actually, it's also the best way to allow me due process, which I am entitled to as well. So I look forward to this opportunity. And I say again, I think if the committee is really interested in having proper, full transparency, then it will be ensuring that everybody who has got relevant information to offer here is before that committee and doing that fully, openly, on the record and on oath, just as I will do on Tuesday.
Jackie Baillie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Every time I ask a question about the Ministerial Code investigation, the First Minister replies with rhetoric about the committee. And I look forward to questioning her on Tuesday at the committee. But my questions are specific to the Ministerial Code investigation that's being conducted by James Hamilton QC. And it isn't just over a question of whether Parliament has been misled that the First Minister should be investigated. Section 2.30 of the Ministerial Code says, and I quote, "Ministers and officials should therefore ensure that their decisions are informed by the appropriate analysis of the legal considerations and that the legal implications of any course of action are considered at the earliest opportunity." We know in the judicial review that there was a significant delay between Council's opinion and the conceding of the case, and it took the threat of senior counsel to resign before the government collapsed the judicial review, costing the taxpayer well over £600,000. So I ask again, if the First Minister is found to have breached the Ministerial Code, will she resign?
First Minister.
Look, Jackie Baillie stands up here and says she's not prejudging the outcome of things in one breath, but in the next breath she says, we know things, before the committee has even heard a single word in oral session from me. So I think Jackie Baillie should really decide whether she's open-minded, objective and impartial on this, or whether she has prejudged. I suspect that for Jackie Baillie and some on the Conservatives, it doesn't matter what I say on Tuesday, the press releases will already be written, just as I suspect they were before my husband appeared for the second time earlier this week. But on the Ministerial Code, I'm well aware of the terms of the Ministerial Code, probably more aware than Jackie Baillie is. I do not consider that I breached the Ministerial Code. I will make that case very, very robustly. And then we will see what the findings of James Hamilton are. And when those findings are arrived at and when those findings are published, remember it was me that referred myself to James Hamilton for this inquiry. So let's wait and see what those findings are, and then we can have all of these discussions. But let's not prejudge the outcome of this. I know why the opposition are desperate to get rid of me. I'm under no illusions about that. But I, just like everybody else, I'm entitled to due process. And I don't need lectures from Jackie Baillie on democracy.
The SNP's Westminster leader Ian Blackford is challenging the Prime Minister to reverse the child poverty crisis across the UK. Mr Blackford says urgent action is required. Listen to this exchange, if you will. The Speaker of the Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, cuts the Prime Minister short, accusing him of simply trying to wind up Mr Blackford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. New research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the baby bank charity Little Village has revealed that 1.3 million children under 5 are living in poverty in the United Kingdom. This is a truly shocking figure that should make this Tory government utterly ashamed. The Scottish National Party has repeatedly called for a financial package to boost household incomes and reverse this Tory child poverty crisis. The Prime Minister has the power to tackle child poverty right now by making the £20 uplift to universal credit permanent and by extending it to legacy benefits. The Tory government's been stalling on this for months. Will the Prime Minister finally act, or will he leave millions of children out in the cold?
Minister. Mr Speaker, I think that the whole House in this country should be proud of the way we've tried to look after people, the poorest and neediest families throughout the country, not just with universal credit, which the party opposite would actually abolish, Mr Speaker, but by helping vulnerable people with their food and their heating bills, the £170 million winter grant scheme, looking after people with the free school meal vouchers. And as I've said before, Mr Speaker, we all put our arms around the people of this entire country throughout the pandemic. Let's return to Scotland with Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
I have to say, Mr Speaker, that was pathetic. That was no answer. We're talking about 1.3 million children under 5 in poverty. Let me quote, "She cried on her doorstep because I gave her nappies, wipes and winter clothes for her child. I went away with a lump in my throat." These are the words of Emily, a baby bank worker who's supporting families that the Tories have pushed into poverty through a decade of cuts. They don't need more empty words from a Prime Minister who simply doesn't care enough to act. Mr Speaker, this morning a new report from Citizen Advice Scotland warned that Tory cuts could reduce the value of universal credit by as much as a quarter, just when people need this money the most. Will the Prime Minister agree to meet with me and other opposition parties ahead of the budget for an urgent summit on tackling child poverty, or will he be yet another Tory Prime Minister who leaves a generation of children languishing in poverty?
Mr Speaker, I must say that I reject entirely what the Right Honourable Gentleman has just said, because I don't believe that any government could have done more to help the people of this country throughout this pandemic, and we will continue to do so. And yes, of course, we bitterly lament and reject the poverty that some families unquestionably suffer. And it is tragic that too many families have had a very, very tough time during this pandemic. But we will continue to support them in all the ways that we have set up. And I may say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, there is a profound philosophical difference between him and me. Because the Scottish Nationalist Party is morphing into ever more a left-wing party that believes fundamentally. There you go, Mr Speaker. That believes fundamentally that it is the duty of the taxpayer to pay for more and and more and more. We want to get people into jobs, Mr. Speaker, and it's getting and it is in that respect that the Scottish Nationalist Party is, I'm afraid, failing their...
Well, Prime Minister, we both know that you're only teasing him and we're trying to wind up the leader of the SNP. Please, let's drop it.